My name is Randi Weingarten, and I'm the new president of the American Federation of Teachers, and I am also delighted to be here on behalf of our 1.4 million members. And I feel like, as Marty was talking, there you are, as Marty was talking, I said, maybe we really were separated at birth, because this is the kind of thing that we have supported for a very, very long time. I mean, if you go back to a couple of my predecessors, Al Shanker, Sandy Feldman, all of us in New York have these intense linkages with the Children's Aid Society, now with some of the organizations that Warren's talked about. We've done a lot of work and understand, as a result, the connections that all the other speakers were talking about. When Ann said, we can't be islands, we can't be dots, we have to create those connections. When we started talking about what the after-school organizations do, what the school-based clinics do, it is time to put it all together in a coordinated way, and that's why we are really delighted to be part of this launch to do so. The community schools have their roots in the turn of the century settlement houses in New York City and Chicago, and the settlement schools in Appalachia. It's a return to the idea that schools, and I think Ann said this, that schools are the community center, and that they are places where students learn to become active citizens in a democracy. And for us, there are places where we all, as adults working with kids, we all step up and take collective responsibility. Let's start moving the term accountability to responsibility, shared responsibility. All of us have responsibility for children. Sandy understood that, Al understood that. That's why they were part of community coalitions long before I was involved in the union. What I've tried to do, both on a local level in New York City, I guess New York City is up there, local level in New York City as well as nationally now, is to ramp up our commitment by doing what so many of you are doing as well right now. I do have to say, though, that we have tried in so many different ways to create that connection, but if we don't do it in a more coordinated way, it's going to get lost. For example, we in New York City have a parent conference every year for 3,000 parents. It is oversold in 2.5 nanoseconds. How do you do something like this where you get it so that every single parent who wants to be engaged in schools, you get them engaged in schools? So it's one of these things that we've started thinking about for, I would say I've only been president for 8 weeks, but it's one of these things we've started thinking about for the last 8 weeks. How do we get involved and how do we do this? The one thing that's surprising to me is that people don't know that teachers and school personnel support community schools. So it's not just in New York City. AFT members around the country have supported community schools, from Portland, Oregon, to Chicago, to Houston, to Philadelphia, to Baltimore, and to Brooklyn. And our members get something big time out of it too. Let me give you one example. The Rafael Cordero School in Brooklyn is not just where Valerie Marquez, who's a UFT member, works, but it is a welcoming place where members of her own family drop in around the clock for learning, healthcare, and volunteer projects. So for all of these reasons, at the AFT convention, my first speech, I laid out a vision for expanding full-service community schools. I asked our delegates to imagine a federal law that promoted community schools, schools that tackle the out-of-school factors that hurt student achievement, schools that provided the neediest kids and families access to health care, counseling, and other social services under one roof, schools that had the education resources our union has long advocated, like quality pre-K, smaller classes, after-school activities, health clinics, materials, technology, and a nurturing environment so that no child feels anonymous, and even, and I know this is tough in this economy, but schools where we bring parents in, where we bring guardians in, where we have schools as communities where if parents need some work to help them get a GED, they can get it at that school, where parents who have limited English proficiency, they can have an English course at that school. That's what we mean when we say schools as community centers. Not that schools have to do it all, but that schools become, just like the church becomes, the center of a community. Ultimately, why do we say this? Why do you hear even my passion on this? Because we get that connection, and teachers in particular understand that poverty, family instability, violence, substance abuse are just some of the few conditions that prevent kids from achieving their true potential. They affect students, they affect parents, they affect teachers, and even though as teachers and as school personnel we try to compensate, we fall short. I love the stories these days about medical duty, for example. It's become part and parcel of every teacher and paraprofessional's job across the country these days. Why? And we heard this about the school clinics, but let me give you one other statistic. There's only one school nurse for every 1,200 public school students these days. And school nurses in many places have to travel to multiple sites, multiple schools, leaving students at risk and forcing untrained staff to fill the gap. So what happens in a school when you don't have a school nurse or a school clinic, when you're dealing with a national epidemic of childhood obesity, asthma, and diabetes? What do we do about that? That's why many of us start teasing about how we've become doctors over the weekends. Recently, then you see, I visited Thurgood Marshall High School in Harlem in the last few days. And there is this amazing health clinic there. And so you see the contrast and the difference between when you have one and when you don't. So all in all, I can go on a whole big riff on No Child Left Behind, but I will not. All in all, this is something that the Teachers Union really believes in. We understand that connection. We understand we have to broaden the accountability measures, and we understand we have to stand together in alliances in order to make this happen. If we don't make it happen, we're not going to close the achievement gap. This is an and situation, not an or situation. I'm delighted, as I said, to be involved in this. Thank you.